All right, my computer says it's 7:30, so let's get started. Can everyone hear me okay? Great. Well, good evening on the East Coast, and welcome to everyone to our third virtual speakers series with the Swiss American Historical Society. I'm Thomas Quinn Marabello, the president. So thank you so much for tuning in. And a special thank you to our presenter this evening, who I will introduce and then turn it over to him. And then we'll have some time at the end for Q&A. So thank you so much to Dr. Jessie Cox for joining us. He is an assistant professor of music at Harvard University. He grew up in Switzerland and just wrote, I believe published just last year, The Sounds of Black Switzerland. So he's going to tell us a little bit more about his background and why he wrote this book and give us a little history that I think we'll find interesting. And this topic, of course, is very, very timely and um, of value to us, I think. So I'm going to be quiet. I think recording is in progress. So I think we're good. So go ahead. Thank you, Dr. Cox.
Thank you so much, Tom, for having me and everyone at the Swiss American Historical Society for making this possible for me to get to share this work. Um, I will I have a PowerPoint. I will share excerpts from the book today, as well as just some more background information about the project. And as I am also a performer, and since the book relies heavily on practice as a kind of method for knowledge production, I also am going to share music that I created, not only of others. Um, Great. So I'll get right into the first piece. A second. Doing the sharing wrong, I think. Okay, let's try that again. Yeah. All right. So this was a piece by Jérémie Jolo, who is based in Biel in Switzerland. And to begin the talk, I wanted to share this piece and a brief excerpt from the book where I write about it. This is from page 63 to 65, in case you already have the book, and slightly edited from that. As Jolo writes in the program notes, music, which he also calls a Frequenzchaos, frequency chaos, is made from musicians who have their own sound, as well as from the sound of the whole group. The piece has a groove reminiscent of Moondog's repeating modal chords and short melodic lines. He combines these pulsating harmonies with a series of filters that move us into different kinds of reverbs or sonic spaces. Myriad of voices, created through Jolo's singing and clarinet playing, again looped and layered on top of each other, dart around each other, and relate in some kind of opaque but poetic way. There are these delays of rhythms, chained like some kind of blurriness between particle and wave, where we can lose ourselves in listening, where it is unclear to us where we are positioned in relation to the beat. The observer's view becomes fuzzy, and the possibility of holding the listener to the observed object in a fixed position fails. In some ways, it reminds me of Julius Eastman's music, like those piano pieces played by Swiss piano quartet Cucuru's, where individual musical pitches become fuzzy and the note's singularity is revealed as an ambiguity of what its place is, something like a black hole. Jolo puts it this way. I quote, "One could jokingly tell somebody to listen to the individual voices and the effort I've put into each one when recording them in 2018. Oh, how impressive. I now listen to the big picture and the whole resultant sound and pay attention to all the repetitions. Oh, how boring. And now close your eyes, go into a meditative state, and it is, through a certain blurriness in perception, music, after all." End of quote. I hear in this statement about what the music does and how it is put together a recognition of this more than in-betweenness, the ways in which the very duality between movement and object, momentum and location, is not where the music happens. Listening becomes problematized. Does one listen after a cut in a mode of duality with waves and particles, or so-called before, which is also within this break, as a blurriness? It is not so much about a more fundamental shared quality or overarching wholeness, as Jolo mentions. That is not the music. Rather, it is about sitting with an open ear in the moment of their articulation, in an interstitial kind of way. Frequencies of individual musicians don't express the music, just as the composite sound of the band doesn't express the music. Rather, the music sits in the opaque relationship, not in between them. Like a quantum field, both field and points, waves and particles, they all make up the field. The field is not a self-existent container of particles or waves, nor are singular particles and waves the field. The relationship amongst these sounds is opaque, is never fully knowable, and it is in this unknownness that the field or relations come to play from and as. Thus this is music. Jolo concludes with "Es lebe das Chaos," which can be translated as "Long lives the chaos." But the transliteral translation would be more something like "It lives the chaos." This bespeaks another kind of way of relating, not because chaos is the opposite of order, but because this kind of order, the one of chaos, is the aliveness of order things, of things that bring forth order sounds as music. Maybe one could hear Jolo's statement in conversation with Edouard Glissant, with how, out of opaque relations that are musical or poetic, in Glissant's words, come to the fore a chaos world, a world in opaque relations. And so it is clear that what we speak of here is something born as thought in the belly of the slave ship, in Blackness, to quote Glissant. This kind of story of relations is one that speaks of a togetherness and aliveness that flows across holds and does away with being in opposition to what is unknown and unforeseeable. It bespeaks the making of relations across what is proper, the here as in relation with the there, and not a violent opposition to the there for a claim to a proper here, a claim to land against other lives. Glissant calls it poetics of relation. The poetic with relation is what shifts relation and poetics out of the known into the unknown. Poetic relations rely on the interconnectedness between different particles as well as their opacity. Relationality is the root and at the same time in excess of itself. Poetic relations are relations in overflow of relations. Central to Sounds of Black Switzerland is that blackness in Switzerland cannot be approached adequately as an already available social object awaiting representation. It must be approached as a problem of audibility, of naming, of the archive, and therefore of listening. What appears in and through this writing is not simply a discourse about music, but a practice of listening that proceeds from music's capacity to refigure what can be heard, taught, and said. The term Black Swiss names a social and historical impossibility internal to Swiss self-understanding. Switzerland is implicitly assumed to be white, while race is disavowed. Blackness is framed as recent, migratory, foreign, and therefore not constitutive of the nation. There's no stable national discourse that allows Black Swissness to appear as a historical and social formation. In that sense, Black Swiss bespeaks something that does not exist. It is or was something we might call empty and silent, as in outside of our possibility for thought. The archive, both historical and otherwise, is thus problematized by and in this book. Following Jacques Derrida, we can say that the archive is not simply a repository of documents or a storehouse of collective memory, but also a structure of authorization. It determines what can appear as history, what can count as evidence, what can be heard as voice, and what kinds of life can be recognized as belonging to society. It gathers, classifies, and consolidates signs into a single corpus or body. Bodies in this account are made from gathering. The archive's authority depends on this act of consignation, of collecting parts and authorizing them as belonging to a whole. That whole, however, can only sustain itself by positing an outside, albeit an erased outside. What falls outside the body of the archive is absolutely unknown until it can be turned into a resource as a part for that body. The archive's authority therefore rests on an extractive and policed relation to what exceeds it. The process of writing this book was uncovering a discourse made non-existent, and in the same turn, the book is a space to open discourses, to make possible a meeting, a conversation, that productively opens our ears to unthought voices. Here you see some of the thinkers I found in this journey of writing the book, such as Tsikuru Batumike, who has written about blackness and Black Africanness in Switzerland since the 90s. Carmel Fröhlicher-Steins, who is a sociologist and has also done research on blackness, black lives in Switzerland since around the 90s, as well as Thilo Frey, who of course now is back in national consciousness since after 2020, especially as one of the first women in general to be in the National Council in the 70s, and Zeda Meyer-Hofer-Mangeli, who is also a sociologist but very active also in working with non-profits and so forth. Here I would stress thus that the absence of a stable national discourse does not mean there were no earlier Black Swiss interventions. In an archive written of blackness, critical fabulation, in the sense of Saite Hartman, becomes necessary, not in order to invent a history, but to think with lives behind the data, beyond what the archive can tell or hold. Theorizing in general, then, shifts from simply uncovering traces to rethink what counts as archival material at all. In this sense, I also see this book as in kinship with the book Farbe bekennen, or Showing Our Colors in English, which is often credited as the so-called beginning of Afro-German studies and written in the 80s by Maya Im, Katrin Oguntoye, and Dagmar Schulz. And the book began with conversations and meetings that Afro-German women organized to get to know each other, to share and learn about their own lived experiences, as well as other Black lives and their histories. These meetings began after a visit by Audre Lorde to the Women's Conference in Berlin in the 80s. And actually, Audre Lorde also visited the Women's Conference in Zurich in the same time period, and Carmel Fröhliche-Steins was there as well. And in this book, Farbe bekennen, we find interviews, discussions, and so forth that reveal the story not only of individuals, but also Black lives in Germany, and making numerous contributions to different fields of research. The archive polices its borders. Listening is policed, knowledge is policed, data is policed. The archive is not passive. It decides what makes sense and what does not, what counts as proper speech and proper citizenship, what becomes intelligible and what becomes legible as knowledge and what remains noise or absence. If the archive claims authority in being able to erase the unknown by taking it into the known whenever it appears, making thus legible whatever comes to be, then the question of Black Switzerland cannot be reduced to inclusion. The issue is not only how to place Black Swiss lives into an already given archive, rather because the erasure of Blackness is the very form of placing into limit and naming that which is other than Swiss, naming it as foreign. Blackness thus exposes the nation and the archive's claim to existence as and in border policing. Furthermore, the structure of the archive maps onto Frank Wilderson's analytical structure of anti-Blackness, from equilibrium to disequilibrium and back. The archive does so continually, turning the unknown into the known. Policing the border of the archive is itself a claim to its sovereignty in this case. Every time the archive encounters what exceeds it, what it cannot yet classify, it claims authority precisely by making that excess legible, by turning it into knowledge. In this sense, the archive is not merely a collection of material, it claims also its own inevitability and omnipresence. What interests me here, however, is that the archive is not only textual, it is not only about what can be written down, stored, and interpreted, it is also a claim over audibility as such and existence as such. The archive is a listening structure. Its authority is not only hermeneutic but ontological. It governs what can count as voice, what can count as speech, what can count as intelligible life, and what can count as sound. It determines what is heard, and it regulates what is noise. It determines what enters knowledge and what remains at the border of sense. This is where W.B. Du Bois becomes indispensable. Under the heading of sociology hesitant, he allows me to think in excess of an archive as self-instituted sovereignty. He does not ask us simply to add the unknown into an already authorized body of knowledge, as if the archive were merely incomplete. Du Bois instead proposes for us to think from the unknown. Life, in other words, should inform the categories, objects, and methods of study in social science, rather than the other way around. Black study then does not merely supplement the archive with new content. It alters the epistemic relation between archive, life, and listening. It shifts something in the archive, in what can be heard, because it asks us to begin not from what is already authorized, but from the live sounds and relations that the archive cannot hold. The archive is, now, here, nothing other than what I may call sounds from the unknown. In Sounds of Black Switzerland, Blackness, Music, and Unthought Voices, I thus decided to begin from musical practice as a space where I did find Black Switzerland or Blackness in Switzerland theorized already, in excess of available archival discourses, or archival materials. One example in the book actually is a work I composed myself for the Lucerne Festival in 2021, titled Alongside the Chorus of Voices. In this piece, small bells are distributed across the concert hall. For Swiss audiences, bells echo the national soundscape. Less visibly, bells are a way to mark ownership and control over movement. While today only for animals, historically this was also used to control enslaved Black lives in the Americas. Today, control, of course, operates differently through identification papers, biometric systems, border checkpoints, etc. But the logic of marking, tracking, and regulating movement persists. In my piece, bells attached to bows, performers, and the ceiling allow listeners the illusion to be able to track individual performers, even individual sounds. Listening becomes a method of identification, identifying a timbre, a performer, a location in space. At first, in this piece, this tracking feels precise and transparent. I can follow this player, I can locate that body, I know that instrument and its timbre. But gradually, gestures become unpredictable, and the music as composition and performance refuses such possibility of transparent access to audibility. Players exchange patterns, sound overlap, the bell tones disperse spatially, and their non-uniformity and multiphonicity is amplified. Identification becomes unsettled. The work thus stages the impossibility of neutral listening. Listening is revealed not as passive reception, but as a tool that has been claimed to afford control, to classify and to exclude. But the music, as performance, as listening practice, refuses such possibility. It only sounds when we lose our ears, our ways of listening within the music itself. Today, for time's sake, I'll play a shorter piece related by material and topic for string quartet, titled Not in Between. The question of listening via audibility is presented most sharply by Charles Uzor's 846 George Floyd in Memoriam. Uzor was born in Udo, Nigeria in 1961 and has lived in St. Gallen since 1968 after fleeing the Biafra War. Having been trained both as a performer and composer, he now composes from and teaches at the Gymnasium in St. Gallen. In this piece, 846, in particular, I uncover a productive critique of John Cage's 433, the so-called first piece totally composed of silence. Uzor returns to Cage's silence as a rethinking of music and listening, but doubles silence. One silence includes audible breathing, the other excludes it. Borrowing from communication technology, we might call these differentiated silences white noise and black noise. Some readings of Cage's 433 present listening as transparent, or, on the other hand, silence and sound as acultural. Uzor reveals that such neutrality is structured, that the very relations between sound and silence, audibility and world is made within listening, or performing, or we may call this musicking. In other words, listening is framed by historical and political structures, while also itself actively transforming sound, silence, and thus audibility in general. Listening is never merely a question of individual choice. For Uzor, as I have learned through conversations and studying his works for Floyd in particular, this is also a criticism of Switzerland's claim to neutrality. Specifically about how Switzerland profits from colonialism and its afterlives in these structures of neo-colonial exploitation and otherwise, often through Switzerland's very positioning as neutral. An example of national significance clarifies this further. In 2007, the Swiss People's Party released the infamous Black Sheep poster, white sheep kicking a black sheep out of Switzerland, widely considered a racist ad. The Geneva municipality responded with a diversity poster showing different colored sheep. On the surface, this response is anti-racist. Yet, as Noemi Michel demonstrates, the response reframed the black sheep's blackness also in some ways as mere color within diversity, displacing the structural question of anti-blackness. There is claimed the diversity of origins, as Switzerland seems to have it since its inception as a modern nation-state due to having multiple languages and cultures. But in doing so, the question of racism becomes displaced to elsewhere, here to a past. Race was acknowledged and erased simultaneously in public discourses. Whiteness remained unmarked and anti-blackness erased through a claim to neutrality as rooted in being a diverse nation in the middle of Europe. This mirrors Uzor's treatment of silence. When neutrality is taken as a given, erasure begins. Identification checks seem neutral, but presuppose suspicion. Those not asked for identification are silently confirmed as normative, since only foreigners are required to show identification. The same logic appears in border control. At the same time, the course cannot discuss race and thus never critique racial profiling. The border functions like listening. It determines in advance what counts as audible. Reading alongside Hortense Spillers and Alexander Veheliye, I treat the archive in this book not simply as a repository of discourse, but as a structure bound to the differential production of the bodies and voices of citizens. Spiller's distinction is decisive here. Before the body, there is the flesh, and if the body marks political subjecthood and citizenship, then the slave cannot properly possess one, but is rendered flesh for proper bodies. Veheliye extends this by showing that flesh is not natural but produced through an elaborate apparatus of violence. What matters from my argument is that the passage from flesh to body is itself the narrative of the archive, from unknown to known. The archive's claim to gather and authorize a corpus depends then on reducing some lives to flesh, so that others may appear as bodies, as citizens, as proper voices. Yet Spiller's hieroglyphics of the flesh also name what exceeds that reduction. Flesh remains before and in excess of the body, and must repeatedly be covered over, identified, and turned into a controllable part. Listening, therefore, cannot be understood simply as an auditory perception. It is one of the means by which the archive and sovereignty police the distinction between body and flesh, citizen and non-citizen, proper voice and noise. What follows from this is that the question of sound and voice, sound and silence, is like the question of body and flesh, a question of the instantiation of sovereignty or existence as such. The problem is whether a sound can be audible. The archive does not merely preserve voices after the fact, it produces audibility. In excess of such archive is the flesh as hieroglyphic, or we might say improper. That is, sound as uncertain in its audibility. This is a kind of recognition that the corpus is broken by its limit as that which makes it in excess of an origin, a kind of kinship relation beyond what can be already heard as relation. Thank you all for listening. And now we'll have a Q&A and conversation. I look forward to your questions and thoughts. Thank you for lending such attentive ears.
Thank you so much. It's really interesting, and I think we all learned something new and some things to certainly think about music and its role and impact. One question I have, and I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about your background. I know that you have roots in the Caribbean and you grew up in Switzerland, and now you're in the U.S. So maybe you can talk a little bit about your background, and also what have you experienced growing up as a black youth in Switzerland and as a black male here in the U.S. And maybe things you've experienced, similarities, differences in both countries when it comes to race and division.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Tom. So yeah, I grew up and was born in Switzerland. My father's side is from Trinidad and Tobago. I have made music or been in music classes since very long. I think I was 3 years old when I started music classes, so my whole life. Um, and I mean, so in the book, I very, mm, very much embrace a kind of maybe we could call it something like diasporic or comparative approach to Black studies in Switzerland. So I really do um, cite a lot of, especially US based, but American or also global, I guess, in the English speaking uh, realm, especially, or discourse scholars in Black studies. But I also um, really, I mean, even following Du Bois, we could say, found it absolutely necessary to try to develop also kind of a critical lens through which we might begin to think the uniqueness of how race and anti-blackness and blackness function in the Swiss, especially context, but also European, and how that might afford for us to have a bigger or a new or expanded view on all these topics that are touched by these questions. Um, so in that sense, I am, there are debates right now um, amongst people in Black European studies, but also people which are not many, very few actually, who are sort of in academia, maybe we could say. Um, but they're doing amazing work and a lot of work and very good work and strong work. There is questions about, how should we relate to um, Blackness in America, which is a more commonly known discourse. In the French language regions, it's maybe also a bit about, France and UK, because that's also like more prominent in its discourse in Europe for Black studies. Um, and this question, in a general sense, is also given already by Tsikuru Batumike in his book. I don't remember which one. I think it was Présence africaine en Suisse, where he already documents how there is a local just discourse that he notices where young people, he specifically remarks, are more drawn to speaking about noir, which is related for him to America, versus his generation is more drawn to speaking about Africain, which is sort of the previous Pan-Africanism generation coming out of colonial time period, right? So for me, then I kind of decided to follow my own route also as you kind of outlined it, as a scholar and artist, where I did, both I have Caribbean connection, but also family in the diaspora, which includes people actually in the US. And then I ended up moving here. So I started getting more and more immersed in the writing here, but also actually there's a very deep connections in the US the connection in the US between Black studies in academia and music, especially improvised music. So this is kind of maybe some of the ways in which this unfolded for me and for how I arrived, the method, I guess we might say, for this book. Yeah. But it is a multi-layered question. Yeah.
Thank you. What other questions do we have for Jessie? Open it up to those on the call.
Hey, Varun, it's great to see you. Maybe you could connect with her.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, great to see you, Jesse. Really, really, I'm really glad to hear some more about some of your work. Um, I had a question for you about the word "unthought," and my understanding of sometimes I hear kind of I think from my perspective, kind of simplistic criticisms of the word, which is like it shouldn't be unthought; it should just be unheard. But from my understanding of debates within Afro-pessimism and current scholarship, is that when the history of blackness is so overdetermined as a history of domination, then the idea of blackness as a series of practices of freedom is in fact unthought, or as you were talking about, the archive makes it unthinkable. But from what I understand about your work is that you're not necessarily trying to reconstruct a history, although that may be part of the work. I feel like you're both trying to describe the present, and especially through the music, I think, is construct a future. So my question for you is how does the concept of the unthought operate for you beyond the historical into the present and the future?
Varun, for this fantastic question and great observations. I mean, so there's one point that relates a bit to Tom's question too, is which is unique or different maybe between the Swiss context and the US context, which is blackness is untaught in general in Switzerland. So it's actually not only like a question of whether it appears as something like Black Death is visible in the archive or something, but it doesn't appear at all in Switzerland, except as something that comes in, so in that sense, it's always displaced, sort of, we might say ontologically, or we can also just say in the sense of like the national mythology or something, yeah. And this is actually a particular modality. I don't really, this book is not uncovering the full history or anything like that, nor am I actually primarily a historian, which is correct. So my work deals a lot more with the present, I think, it's fair to say. But in my research, I realized it is historical, but it's not reducible to historical because it's also how these things become language and thinkable. So, for example, a way that one can explain it is if one looks at newspapers, there's a great newspaper archive for Switzerland that's available online. It's probably most of you know about it in the Swiss American Historical Society. And I like to, for artworks, actually, I perused it for specifically references to blackness and different words, because as I was mentioning, there is not a unified term for black in Switzerland. This has to do with various reasons, which I can go into if you want me to. You can ask about it too. And so what I noticed in that search is that there's also a change around the 60s, 70s, 80s in the language of how blackness appears. So racial discourse pretty much disappears, and becomes national discourse, specifically often about foreigners, Africa, and things like that. And interestingly, we have a similar set of mechanisms, I guess we could say, happening around how law deals with race more after Schengen, especially, which is what I look at more. So after 2007. So for me, I had to come to grips with this multiple forms of erasure, multiple steps and multiple forms. So I could not have a term, I could not have statistics, and I could not have a discourse, even one which I would listen to on the ground or something, you know, like doing anthropological research. Nor would I be okay with imposing a discourse, because I think that would have missed a lot of possibility. So this is kind of my answer. So, but the word itself, Unthought, actually kind of only came in editing as that word. I think I might have used it before, but it really became like that word. I mean, I know it has philosophical consequences, and those I have to still explore myself, actually, specifically related to, I think, Saidiya Hartman's work and Heidegger and things like that. But yeah. Thanks for that question. I think, Chris, you had a question as well.
Well, I really didn't know what this presentation was going to be all about tonight, but thank you for addressing the elephant in the room, because I think racism is something that Americans deal with on a daily basis. If you're not in it, you're at least reading about it. And I saw the George Floyd reference, and you live in America now. So we are not bereft of discussion about or problems with racism here. And actually, I'm by the way, a geography teacher. I use that poster that you noted in my course. And of course, that's been an issue in Europe, particularly with immigration. But are you finding that you can find more even inspiration from living here in US and then transferring it over to a European way of thought? And I loved the piece with all of the different sounds. It sort of had a dissonance to it. And it caught me like, you know, you need to listen and pay attention. And I think that the music sort of spoke to that, if you will, in not words, but in action. So I guess I just want to get down to, are you finding a lot of inspiration from our context here in the US?
Thank you, Chris. That was a wonderful question, and I love the space background. This, I think, you know, so Charles Uzor, for example, right, writing, not even just Charles Uzor, but in general, actually, maybe I'll show you this image. I wanted to show it, and I didn't show it, just kind of time ran out, so I was like, but this is the last video was actually me performing in Lausanne. And this image is listing the word, you know, in the protest signs, you see this word Mike, justice for Mike. Yeah. So this is actually what happened in Switzerland. The protests, Black Lives Matter protests, started using the Mike and Peters, because there is this Swiss Nigerian man called Mike Ben Peters who died in 2018 in a similar scenario as Floyd. And I had to say died. So firstly, the protests influenced or correspond. So there's a kind of conversation happening. But then also, he died, and I had to say the word die because there were multiple court cases which tried to, you know, address this question of why he died, being kneeled on by 4 police officers, or even 7 or something. I forgot now. Sorry, forgive me. And then um, some of those cases were actually taken on by US lawyers. And then on top of that, um, that is to say, the 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 inspiration is not just, I guess something like an aesthetic, like, oh, I'm inspired, and but the thing is external to me or something like that, like an aesthetic, romanticized idea of inspiration. But it's actually actual conversations and relations that are sometimes not easily recognizable, or uh, where we have not really the language, I think, to talk about. For example, one way I start to talk about this now is like we have to kind of think about a new form of theorizing Afro-diaspora, which also was theorized on the Pan-Africanism with regards to Black Lives Matter, because of how their theory, thinking, practice, and activity became exchanged, inspired by each other, and shared across borders. Um, yeah, so these are just a few beginning of the points. And then there is a really great organization which has developed a lot of work actually over the time of me writing this book. It's called Alliance Against Racial Profiling, which is a Swiss organization, but they started with a case that I wrote about, which is Mohamed Wabail. And it's fascinating right now going on their website because they have advice what to do when you get called up to be identifying yourself. And basically, we cannot do anything because racism is not legible at all. Even though in the case of Wabail, for example, the judge said, oh, this actually makes sense. But then he said, but there is no way for me to say anything about this. So we need to follow our other rules. So the discrimination laws we have, and so forth, don't allow for it to be spoken, so to speak, or legible. So in that sense, it's also untaught. Sorry, I kind of went on a longer explanation, but I would love to take some more questions. These are really inspiring questions. Yeah.
Do we have some more questions?
Yeah. Dr. Cox, thank you so much for your presentation. Just so on this notion that racial discourse is suppressed or is not allowed in Switzerland, how was that? So in growing up in Switzerland, how did that affect your experience growing up? Just curious.
Oh, I mean, it's basically like, so the reason why the discourse doesn't exist is because of this constant displacement. That's how I analyze it. So this is to say, it's there, but it's not there, like purposefully made. So for example, you will have racial profiling, or you'll have something like this racist ad, right? But then it's displaced to a past. The same happens with space. Often it's displaced to the Americas. So, or there's, a racist problem or something. They might even say, okay, this is racist, but it's not applicable here or now. Or it might even be displaced in the form of migration. So we can collect statistics on immigration. That's no problem. We can talk about racism and race with immigration. Of course, there's other things to note here, but that's where it exists. It exists at the border. Once you're part of the citizen or part of the national more discourse, it's very much non-existent, non-thinkable, really. Um, I mean, how it affects things is like, for example, you can't have legally, right? So, for example, you can't actually make the claim that something happened because of racism. Like, even racial policing cannot be named as racial in its critique because that would That's not legible. So this police can actually then sue this person. So this is what happened with Biel. So he said it was racism, and then or maybe not, yeah, Biel, I think, or other case, I can't recall right now as well, but um, basically the police would then sue whoever says this is racism. Under the law of discrimination, this is applicable because racism is not a thing, it's discrimination. So that's one way that it might show up legally, but then it can also show up, for example, in the sense like just discursively, right? So that you cannot say something like, um, mm, um, oh, for example, with the Black Sheep poster, there's this example of um, Noemi Michel analyzes this example of how the politician for the SVP said something about, well, black is just a color. So it's the same as when I say black wine, so Pinot Noir, obviously. And basically, it means that automatically the word becomes translated or transposed into uh, meaningless, right? In the social sense. So this is, and statistically too, so there's no racial statistics. This can have different reasons, maybe it's partly because of World War II, similar histories like that, like in France, etc. But you cannot actually talk about it at all. And so even one of the fascinating things I found was that when Carmel Fröhliche-Steins tried to do social research, social science, she's a sociologist, she had to define what she is analyzing in that text in the first paragraph. And that kind of struck me because there was no discourse that could make it easily accessible to speak about such a thing as Black Swiss experience. She had to say, well, I define Black Swissness right here for this as, and she took a common way that we define it, kinship and uh, African ancestry, basically. And I think she says, and skin tone or something like that, phenotype type, typical markers or something. So that's actually kind of showing you how unthinkable and illegible the discourse itself is. Um, and this is, again, this, I think if we were to research before the Second World War, before post-colonial period, it would show up a bit different. Um, but yeah, this is where we were at. I think actually since 2020, a lot has been happening, not just that everything has changed, it's still the same in certain senses, like for example, legal discourse and things. But I do think there is more conversations appearing, at least from my optimistic point of view. Yeah. Thanks for the question. I appreciate it.
Well, I think this is a good place to stop. It's been almost exactly an hour, and I just want to say thank you again, Jessie, for your thoughtful remarks and enlightening us a little bit. I know your book is out there for purchase, so people can just Google "Sounds of Black Switzerland," and if you want to get a copy, it's pretty, I think, easy to do. I believe the publisher is Duke University Press. Uh,
That's right. I can put it in the chat as well.
Great. Um, so anyway, so thank you so much for again for your time, for um, giving us this opportunity to learn a little bit more about a different aspect of Switzerland and connections between the U.S. and Switzerland, which our society is sort of all about. And we really appreciate you doing this for us, and hopefully there'll be opportunities in the future for collaboration. And thank you to everyone for coming. Several of our uh, officers were here as well. And really appreciate everyone's interest. Yeah, so it's dukeupress.edu. Sounds of Black Switzerland. It should be showing up there in the chat. Thank you again, Jesse. Really, really, again, appreciate this. Thank you, everyone, for joining. We will be uploading this to our YouTube channel hopefully tomorrow, and so more people can who weren't able to join us tonight can watch and learn. And anyway, thank you again, everyone. Have a good evening.
And
Appreciate it.
thank you all, and thank you, Tom, and thank you to the Swiss American Historical Society for making this happen and having me here. Thank you.
Our pleasure. Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.
Bye.